digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. And today we are joined once again by Dave Ranyard from Dream Reality Interactive, and also with us Eric from Made in Me. Welcome, chaps.
Hello.
Hello, hello. This is our 100th episode. I had to mention this. I have to say this somewhere before we forget to mention. It is our 100th episode. So thank you everybody who listens to our show and keep on listening, because we're going to keep going. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of the creative industries and specifically what we need to do to grow the VR industry. But before we get into the meat of that conversation, why don't you just remind our lovely listeners about who you are and what you do? And why don't we start with you, Eric? Why don't you tell us all about what you're up to at Made in Me?
Sure. So I'm development director at Made in Me. We are sort of a creative agency, a digital publisher for kids. We make apps and digital books for kids. What we've been up to recently is, I guess what's interesting about us is that even though our core business is all about apps and sort of digital entertainment for kids, we've really moved into the licensing space, and it's all about doing licensing deals for physical books, doing television development deals on the brands that we launch digitally. So we're a digital company with a very actually traditional business model, although it didn't start out that way.
Okay, Dave, why don't you tell us all about Dream Reality Interactive?
Sure. So I was a video game developer at Sony for a long time, and then a year ago this month I left and started setting up my own VR studio, which is Dream Reality Interactive. We've now got under 10 of us in Farringdon and a number of different projects on the go, games and VR experiences. So interactive VR is basically where we're at. Yeah, it's a great place to be.
Lovely. So now that we know who everybody is, what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about this issue around what it's going to take to sustain the VR and in immersive entertainment industries. And I say this on the basis of, we have what everybody's talking about at the moment is the content war, which is lots of good, high-quality content that people need to see filtrate into this market. But what nobody's really talking about a huge amount just yet is the talent wars. And that's going to be the shortage of high-quality talent, experienced talent, who are able to be able to create these high-quality content pieces that people are looking for. And I want to start with you, Dave, just because of your experiences with Sony and kind of where you're coming from in the games industry side of things. What your perspective is in terms of that talent that's emerging into VR and where it's coming from. When we're talking about the games talent that's pivoting into VR, what do you think are those key issues around how do we make sure that we're getting more talent coming into the space, but also how we readdressing existing skill sets to make sure that people are able to do high quality content in VR?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, we have a lot of very passionate developers who have, it's kind of been a grassroots. We know this, Tanya, because we've been at all these events for the last few years. So there is this great grassroots passion out there, and that's really exciting, and harnessing that is brilliant. But to scale, I think there's a few things that need to happen. Certainly, people from other industries pivot. So as we've discussed in the past, actors working in mocap rather than traditional acting. So, we've seen this real increase in excitement around immersive theatre, for example, because the people with those skills suddenly have been in demand. And it's like immersive theatre, 4 or 5 years ago was pretty niche, whereas now with VR, that's actually a cookie cutter of that. So it's suddenly an explosion in a similar way that apps suddenly exploded how people could, carry a computer in their pocket, so to speak. So we can see that pivot will happen, and some people are able to pivot and get that right, but other people might need some support and training and that sort of thing. I do think one of the interesting things around this actually is, if you look at the creative spaces, I've always felt that games has been traditionally sort of viewed on a little bit negatively. I have this sort of fairly, I don't know, it's a bit sarcastic view that first of all, games were kind of like the sort of awkward second cousin of the entertainment industry, and nobody really wanted to take them seriously.
The embarrassing cousin.
Embarrassing cousin, yeah. And then they suddenly started making money, and so they became like the Beverly Hillbillies, sort of all money and no class.
Oh dear.
But now
we love the games industry here. We really do.
I am a fan of the games, so I'm being kind of self-referential and ironic. But now I think in immersive technologies, So for example, people making movies are using gaming engines. People who make other interactive experiences are using gaming engines. And so I actually think it's leveling the playing field, which is has a lot of positives, but it also means that those skills are going to be in demand. So the people who have got them will actually cost more, and rightly so. But then that makes it in a time where there's still not a big market where you've got kind of guaranteed return on what you're doing. Actually, for the few number of people that can really do it, their price is going up, makes it harder. So then we'll have to scout for other people and bring them in. So recently I've just taken on a student from NFTS.
Oh yes.
And so it's really interesting, you go there and quite a few people are looking at VR as part of their project. So that's really good. That those sorts of schools are engaging early in immersive tech, but it's still, the numbers are small.
Yeah. And here's the thing as well is that there's two comments I would make about this. The first of all is that actually some of the best VR talent is the talent that's coming directly out of universities or training courses who haven't learnt any bad habits yet, if that makes sense. And they're very open-minded and they're thinking in these three-dimensional spaces, and they're able to really kind of leap straight into it. And that's one really interesting point. But the second point that I think a lot of people haven't given a huge amount of thought to is the fact that, yes, in the games industry, we actually have a very small pool of talent who are really good at this stuff, who can supply the games industry folk who are games driven but are doing VR. Those people are also wanted by the film industry and by the entertainment industries who are also creating VR. But then we look outside of the entertainment vertical as a whole, and you have people like automotive industries and property industries and medical industries and education and all these other verticals where actually all of these people, they want good people who can help them to create the VR experiences that they're also trying to create. And so it's going to be this huge shortage, not just within entertainment verticals, but across the board, because all of those other external industries already have issues connecting to the talent as it is. We get asked an awful lot about building these bridges between the automotive industry and the games industry because they want to borrow the games industry talent. So, it's kind of difficult enough already as it is. But as we move forward, we're going to see more and more industries trying to scramble for that very small pool of talent.
Just before we go, one of the positives we have is passion. It's even back in the day, 10 to 15 years ago, we would lose a couple of technical people to the city, for example, because they could earn more money.
Yeah.
But the passion of making games and entertainment does keep people there. But you're right, it's a tough place to be, especially in a burgeoning market.
Indeed. But Eric, I'm curious to hear from you, from your perspective, bearing in mind that you're working more with licenses and with kind of publishing, where you see the impact of this kind of quite small current talent pool, how that's going to impact people who are coming at it from a slightly different perspective, such as publishing.
Sure. I mean, I think, when Dave and you were just talking about, creating VR, AR experiences, I know that there are several authors who are now being hired by games companies to actually write games specifically for VR, AR experiences, but also for games in general. And I think, publishing book writers and authors are an untapped pool. That part of that is because, I'll be honest in that I think a lot of authors are scared of technology. You have this kind of stereotypical sort of stereotype of an author being someone who's like very introverted, kind of sitting in a room alone, sort of writing, their books, not having to interact with people. Although, which I suppose you can say, is a stereotype for a gamer as well. But many of these people they find new technologies to be really scary, but there are lots of authors who are willing to try new things. And so I think there's a great crossover happening now. And even to the point where I know that a lot of the publishers who are much more forward thinking, who own some of their IPs, especially in the children's area, are looking at, okay, so, we own this children's IP. We've exploited it in picture books, in television. What can we do in games, and in particular now with AR and VR? And there's a little company who they started out as publishing people called Pips Island. They're based in New York, and they've just launched this sort of immersive theater show for kids. But they're publishing people who've decided that, wow, this is the new way of telling stories. So I just think that there's a pool of talent with authors, and it's about showing them that it's not scary, that it's actually a lot of fun, and what the potential is for storytelling in the future.
Okay, so we're talking about these authors who are beginning to kind of get more and more kind of, I'm using the word immersed into the kind of immersive industries and VR industries. And we're talking about all that talent that Dave is talking about. And I suppose the interesting question from a Hollywood model, shall we say, is that traditionally talent, and by that we mean actors, producers, directors, the people that the agencies feel are worth representing because they feel that there is, a talent worth representing, have not yet begun to represent VR talent. And I'm curious to understand from your perspectives how you feel that that's going to shift. So, for example, if somebody was representing a traditional author, how they would then begin to shift that author into being represented as a VR author or a VR narrative writer?
It's a good question, because I would say most literary agents don't know the companies that are actually hiring writers for those formats. So I don't think they're connected. I mean, about 10 years ago, there were a handful of agents who represented a writer who could get a writing gig for film, theater, anything. And tends to be more in America as well. And I think the last industry that literary agents aren't as connected to as they could be is the gaming industry. The divide somehow.
And what about you, Dave, from your perspective?
Well, I've worked with a number of different writers over the years, including J.K. Rowling. Actually, one of the things that can be not for her, but for traditional writers, as you said, they can be a little bit scared of technology, but also the interactive nature does mean you have to write and deliver in a different format. And, for example, a script for a game is probably a lot longer than for a film. And the interactive nature of, what's required. And actually, you can work on that script with not just one person. You can actually, okay, right, you're going to do all the squadron dialogue, etc., etc. So you can sort of split it up like that. But that can be a challenge, and it can be tricky sometimes to work with well-known people when they've got a specific idea of what story they want to tell, and they don't really understand the nature of gaming
and the architecture behind it, really.
Yeah.
And I'd also say, I mean, it's interesting to me. Years ago, when I was at Penguin in Australia, actually, I'd hired a writer from Disney who wrote one of the films to adapt one of the books, the movie tie-in books. And the first draft manuscript we got back from this film writer, it read like a list of directions. Like, he walks into the street, he looks at the car, he gets in the car, he drives away. And it was like, no, this isn't how you would write it as a book. And so I do think that there are differences in formats that aren't impossible to get over, but I think some writers are best at writing certain genres or certain formats, and it doesn't necessarily translate. But, the really good ones can do everything, like J.K. Rowling. See anything.
At the moment, I'm working with a guy called Cy Spencer, who's a comic book writer. And interestingly, although sometimes we have to sort of remind him, as you say, of it's not as fixed camera, as, if you like, or as fixed. Comic book writers are pretty good because, so for example, we're working on something where we said we don't really want any dialogue, but we're using a writer, and he's able to visualize, like visualizing the panels that would be in a comic book is not dissimilar to visualizing the player's experience. So I found that quite productive.
We've found that to be the case as well with comic book writers, is that they're really good at non-verbal communication and conveying that non-verbal communication, which is incredibly difficult for people who, are used to writing in slightly different ways. But I am curious, just from what you're both saying, I'm wondering if perhaps there is a new role that could be emerging, which is almost to act as the translator between traditional writing styles and immersive writing styles. So that person who kind of says, look, you're a great novelist or you're a great, screenwriter, but let's take your great idea as a screen, play and now convert this into something that is immersive. And that person is the person who has that expertise in terms of, narrative design architecture and game design architecture to be able to actually make it into an immersive, interactive experience versus, somebody who's just got a book and says, I'm going to make this book into a VR experience. Do you think that could be an interesting new role that emerges, or do we think it has to be that thing where actually the writer has to be able to do that entire thing themselves?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I think that in some ways, I know a few book writers who've tried writing theater, which is, I guess, closer to an immersive experience, and it was difficult for them because the stage directions they wrote in a really sort of like florid, long prose, and that's not really what you need to do. So I think there's training, but I wonder if it's about sort of more kind of interdisciplinary events where writers from different, I don't know if this exists, like an event where writers from different, who write for different formats meet, talk about their craft of writing, how it's different.
Interesting you should mention this, Eric. This would be a perfect time to mention the VR Writers' Room. Which does exactly this. It brings together writers from... So the VR Writers' Room brings together writers from different industries to talk about the future of narrative design and creative storytelling for immersive entertainment formats. So we bring writers from film and game and TV and comics and theatre and immersive theatre and transmedia and out-of-home theme park industries to talk about actually how they currently write, and then look at how can we fuse these styles, these methodologies together into something that works for immersive storytelling. So, yeah.
I can think of a number of book authors who would love it and be really good.
So just as a small plug, I'll mention that we have our next VR Writers' Room live session in New York on March the 14th, hosted at Google's offices, and you can find the links on our social media. We'll make sure to push those links out for you. But we're certainly hosting that in partnership with BAFTA New York. So, having said all of that, I want to go back to this question of the agent and the representation of these individuals, because you're talking about people who need to maybe pivot their skills and extend their skills. But I'm curious, Dave, from your perspective, from the games industry perspective, we don't have that traditional kind of representation, in as much as we don't really often find game writers who have agents in Hollywood who are going to help them to get jobs, in other mediums, or even if you're a creative director or a producer or an associate producer for a game title, we don't really see people being represented by agents or talent, companies or anything of that sort. And I'm curious from your perspective what you think will happen over this next kind of 5 to 10 year period as we see this rise in popularity of the immersive entertainment formats, and therefore the need for that talent to be represented.
Well, I see a general trend, which is, and I've experienced this personally, which is, if you look at films in the 30s, it was all studio system. Everybody was on a contract to the studio, and actually was probably less representation. I think there was around the actors, but not so much around the writers. And then the film industry moved into much more of independent model. So the studios still put up the funds or back the films and sign them, but they're signing them through independent companies, and they build like a company to make the film.
Yeah,
I think that sort of thing is starting to happen in games. And so as that process goes through, I think we'll start to see some people represented more and more, And also, it's things like having the middleware. So, when I started making games, you had to build everything from scratch, even like the font system.
Back in the day. Yes.
Back in the day, yeah. You have to write a low-level font handling system for every single game, and so there's no way then you could do it. But now, as things are standardised and it's Unity or Unreal or Crytek, you can list out those skills, and it's a lot easier. So I think it will start to happen. And also, we're starting to see, quote, superstars of creative directors and things like that. So I think it will, you're starting to get that sense of a film director, game director, and I'm not saying the same, one's the Beverly Hillbillies and one isn't, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but I think, I agree with you, Dave, but I also think that the reason a lot of game writers may not have agents is there is that sort of bias with agents about the Beverly Hillbillies type of thing. It's like, oh, you're not a real writer, though, are you? But I think that is changing. But again, it's just about education, and I think it's about getting agents aware of what this is now. Well, more importantly, how much revenue they can make for themselves and their writer from these.
Yeah. I've actually noticed an interesting thing as well. There's a few, certainly on the sort of teen books and younger books. There's quite a few books that are being written by game designers. And I think that's quite interesting because
it's starting to happen more and more. And I wonder if it's about having game designers and game writers go to places like London Book Fair, to Bologna, where they can meet agents and things like that as well. I don't know.
Maybe we should set up a little trade mission to make that happen.
A digital jam sort of trade mission.
You heard it here first, people. No, but I am really curious about this whole thing of game designers, game writers becoming more kind of novelists or screenplay writers, or they're kind of starting to blossom into these other areas. I find this really interesting because we do find, so, from our perspective, Dave and I, when you work with a new game IP, oftentimes I'll walk into, the process as they're kind of getting ready to launch the product. So I'm not necessarily there during the development of the product itself. But what will invariably happen is somebody will hand me, maybe 2 or 3 ring binders, the big A4 ring binders, and kind of go, here's 3 millennia worth of backstory for this universe, have at it. And you're just kind of like, this is such a rich and immense, storytelling universe. It easily rivals the scope of universes like Star Wars or Marvel. And yet we do that for every single game. And so in some ways, I do think that there is this unfair advantage almost that game narrative designers have, which is that ability to think in these really epic, broad strokes to create these very vast environments from which to tell multiple stories. And I do think that that's quite an interesting skill and particular talent that is very, very fundamental to the games industry. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that one, Eric.
Yeah, definitely. But I think, I think it's a slightly different way that book authors think about it. Sure, there's world building and there's sort of thought about a story arc, but I think it's rarely so huge. I mean, even something like Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit was the first book and it was meant to just be a standalone. And so, the rest of Lord of the Rings was sort of written afterwards, and sort of, there's some contradictory story elements between The Hobbit and the rest of the 3 books because it was written later. So I don't think most book writers think about it in that big of a way. But I suppose it's because the product needs to be something that's discrete. It can feel really big in this one book, but it's it's sold as like a story. These days it's different. It's I think books, especially in sort of genre fiction and even in YA, how films now, it's like let's make 3 of them. Let's take this story and make 3 films out of it.
Peter Jackson, darn you.
This block model. And so I think because of that, book authors are needing to think bigger now. But it wasn't the case before, I think.
Okay. And Dave?
I think that's really true. I mean, if you look at, to be honest, I'm pretty sure to sign any major movie now, you've got to have a franchise plan. And if you look at, interestingly, probably the biggest movies around at the moment actually come from comics. I mean, maybe Star Wars aside. Yeah. Well, it's either like it's a great book, so it's a great story, so it gets made into a movie, or it's a franchise that can come from comic book IP, for example. And these are, you're right, these are similar skills. But I think it also shows that it's been going on for a while. So 30, 40, 50 years ago, comic books were seen as were probably the way games are seen now.
Very niche, very geeky.
Very weird, geeky side thing. And then now they're dominating the box office.
It is interesting because it is that mainstream ignorance almost of comic books that allows that to happen. Like I remember when what was called Edge of Tomorrow came out, and people were like, this is actually a really good film, but they didn't know that it came from a comic book. And so it is always playing on that kind of mainstream ignorance.
It's interesting to see it's gone through different types of media, back in the day, detective novels were seen as pulp fiction, and then now that's kind of quite a high class genre, and we see it a lot. Sherlock, Silent Witness, all these shows, it's classic detective fiction, but that was seen as real pulp fiction at one time.
Yeah, and Charles Dickens as well was not sort of was sort of magazine serials. So yeah.
So I just find it very interesting how it changes. But I think probably the bigger thing here is, because I saw somebody do a talk, and I won't name them. But
name names, come on.
They said no. They were saying they were saying that they were in VR and immersive tech. They were drawing a line between like films and games, and I said, why are you making a distinction between films and games in VR? Because they were talking about having doing stories that were somewhat interactive, but games were somehow more interactive, as though there was a delineation.
Yeah.
But I think even in non-VR, there's a lot of games now that don't have a high score, or you play Journey and it's an experience. It's not a high score and shooting aliens.
Well, most high-end games nowadays, you could pretty much make a movie with all the cutscenes.
Yeah, and so but I actually think that we shouldn't be delineating between the two because it's a new thing.
And I fully agree with you on this, because I do think that what that does is it kind of tends to demonstrate the origin of the person who's talking about it in that way. You know, when they say it's very film orientated or it's very game orientated or there's this difference, it's actually because they're bringing their previous biases from whichever industry they worked in to this new medium. And it is incredibly worrying when you're kind of looking at it and saying, but it's a new medium. It doesn't abide to either of your rule sets. And you need to be thinking about this in terms of blue sky. It's completely new. And because of that, I do think we end up with some quite restrictive thinking sometimes about what's possible and what's not in the medium.
Yeah, I agree.
So, gentlemen, as always, we like to ask one of these lovely broad scoping questions. And I'm going to throw this one at you, which is, what do you think is the single biggest thing that could happen, be it technological, cultural, whatever it may be, that will help to push forward the VR industry in the next 5 to 10 years? What do you think is going to be that big game changer? And I'll start with you, Dave.
Okay, I'm going to say that I don't think we've seen the experience, entertainment, game, whatever, that gets you really coming back for more. I think we've seen things that are really cool, exciting. We've got some sort of game properties that are as addictive as, or are structured in a similar way to a traditional game where you've got missions and you want to finish it. But I don't think we've seen the thing. It's like, what is the Snapchat of VR? You know, that thing that gets people hooked either socially or for whatever reason, they're coming back every day or every week for more. And I think that when that happens, it'll have a huge impact.
Okay, so whatever the next Pokemon Go of VR is, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Eric, what's your thoughts on this?
I think it's related in that there needs to be, when there's a mass market platform that's cheap enough and that's accessible, like the Netflix of VR, that everyone just has an account. You have whatever device it is you need to experience it, but it's cheap. You could buy it for $10 at Tesco. And then I think companies will start investing in content for it as well, because I think so many people have been burnt by apps that people that I speak with of VR are like, I just don't have that money anymore.
Yeah. And I think there is a perception at the moment that it is quite an expensive thing to do if you want to do it properly. Yes. You know, if you want an Oculus or you want a HTC, you know, you're talking thousands before you're really able to get a decent setup. And I think that does put off quite a few people. I'm curious to see how PlayStation kind of works out in terms of being that middleman, somewhere in the middle, reasonably affordable, reasonably high quality, but definitely not, you know, a throwaway type of item. So I'm curious to see how that kind of pans out. But gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for joining us on this Digital Jam session. As always, we like to ask you to share with us your social media handle of choice so that our lovely listeners can find out a little bit more about what you're up to. So if you would like to tell us what that is, Eric.
My Twitter handle is DinoBoy89.
Thank you. And Dave.
My Twitter is Dr. Dave, which is Dr__Dave.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And thank you for joining us and listening to this Digital Jam session, the 100th episode of the Digital Jam sessions.
And congratulations.
Thank you. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd.
DigitalJamSessions.com